The first thing I ever learned about Alpha Caden Blackthorn was that he was a monster. Not in the romantic sense. Not in the way the young she-wolves in our pack whispered about him with flushed cheeks and low voices, calling him dangerous the way they meant thrilling. I mean a real monster. The kind my mother described with shaking hands and a jaw so tight her teeth could crack stone. He killed your father, she told me the night of my 7th birthday, when I asked why I didn't have a dad like the other cubs. She was braiding my dark hair she always looked at a second too long, like it reminded her of someone she hated. He challenged him and tore his throat out. That's the kind of wolf Caden Blackthorn is. That's why we left Ironmore Pack. That's why we never go back. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my mother. She smelled like home and pine sap and truth. I was 22 years old before I learned she smelled like lies. My name is Lena Vasquez, and I grew up in the Asheville Pack, a small, scrappy band of wolves tucked into the northern rim of Montana, where the winters came early and stayed late and everyone minded their own business because everyone had something to hide. We weren't powerful. We weren't ancient. We were the kind of pack that collected strays and runaways and people who needed a second chance at a life they'd burned down somewhere else. My mother, Nadia Vasquez, was the beta female. Not because she was strong, though she was, but because she'd arrived at Asheville with a newborn baby on her hip and a story that made even the hardest wolves go soft. A young widow, she said. Escaped a tyrant alpha who'd killed her mate and would have killed her too if she hadn't run. The pack loved her for her suffering. And they loved me because I was the symbol of it. I grew up with that story wrapped around me like a second skin. My father was Jonas Vasquez, a brave, gentle wolf who had challenged the monstrous Caden Blackthorn for control of Ironmore Pack. And lost. My father was a hero, Caden Blackthorn was his executioner. I hated Caden Blackthorn with every cell in my body for 15 years. I hated him when I trained in the mornings, throwing punches at a bag like I was hitting his face. I hated him when I ran the mountain trails, imagining the day I was strong enough to go back to Ironmore and make him answer for what he'd done. I hated him when I heard his name on the lips of visiting wolves who spoke of him with that reverent, slightly terrified tone that powerful alphas always inspired. Blackthorn's expanded his territory again. Blackthorn settled the dispute between the Coal Driver and Greymount packs, single-handedly, they say. Blackthorn hasn't taken a Luna. 15 years and no mate. Strange for an alpha. That last one always made my mother's face do something complicated. A tightening around the eyes. A swallow deliberate to be casual. I never understood it. I filed it away the way you file things you don't have words for yet. The trouble started 3 weeks before my 22nd birthday, when a wolf I'd never seen came through Asheville. He was an Ironmore wolf. I could tell by his scent, something deep and dark like cedar smoke and iron, different from the pine and river stone smell of our northern pack. He was young, maybe 19, and he was running. Not from a threat. Running like a messenger, lean and purposeful, barely stopping to breathe. He asked to speak to our alpha, Renner, and they were closed in the lodge for 2 hours. When he left, he looked at me. Not a passing glance, a look. The kind that has recognition in it. He stared at my face like he was completing a puzzle, and something moved through his expression, surprise, then certainty, then something that looked almost like grief. I started toward him. Do I know you? He took a step back. His eyes cut toward the lodge window, where Renner was watching. Then he shook his head once sharp and left. That night Renner came to our cabin. He sat at our kitchen table with his big hands wrapped around a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from. And he looked at my mother the way adults look at each other when they've agreed to have a conversati. And now that it's here, neither one wants to start it. Nadia, he said. The Ironmore Pack is requesting Lena's presence at their territory summit next month. My mother went still in a way that wasn't human. Wolf still. Predator still. The kind of stillness that comes before violence or flight. No, she said. The request came from Alpha Blackthorn himself. The coffee mug in my hand cracked. I looked down. I hadn't realized I was holding it that tightly. Why? I asked. My voice was calm. I was impressed by that. Inside, I was a struck bell, ringing and ringing. Why would he want me there? Renner looked at my mother. She looked at the table. Mom. Nothing, Mom. She stood up. Walked to the window. Stood there with her back to us, arms crossed over her chest like she was holding herself together. Tell him no, she said. Tell him she's not coming. Tell him whatever you want. Nadia, if I refuse an alpha of his standing, I don't care about his standing. Her voice cracked on the last word. Just barely. But I heard it. I had very good ears. I set down what was left of the mug. I looked at Renner. Tell me what the messenger said. Renner looked at my mother's back for a long moment. I watched something pass through him, a decision. He turned to me. The messenger said that Alpha Blackthorn has reason to believe you may be his daughter. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. My mother didn't turn around. Didn't move. Didn't make a sound. She just stood there at the window while the world rearranged itself around me. All the furniture of my identity sliding across the floor like we'd hit a wave. That's insane, I said. My voice still sounded calm. I hated my voice, Nadia. Renner's voice was very quiet now, careful. The voice he used with injured wolves. Is there anything you want to tell Lena? She turned around then. And I saw it, the thing I'd always filed away without words. Her eyes were wet. Not crying, just wet. Like she was standing at the edge of crying and holding herself back through sheer force of will. He's trying to manipulate you, she said. That's what he does. He wants to get to you because you're strong, because you'd be an asset to his pack, because, Mom. Stop, I stood up. Is Jonas Vasquez my father? She opened her mouth. Don't lie to me. My voice wasn't calm anymore. It was shaking, but not with weakness, with pressure like a pipe with too much running through it. I will know. I've always known when you lie, even when I didn't know what you were lying about. Is Jonas Vasquez my biological father? The wet in her eyes spilled over. Just one tear on the left side. She wiped it away like it was an insult. No, she whispered. And there it was. The lie they'd fed me like medicine. Every day, with love, with the best of intentions, flavored with enough truth. There was a Jonas, there was a challenge, there was a fight to go down smooth. Part 2, Ironmore. I left for Ironmore 3 days later. My mother begged me not to go. She cried in a way I had never seen her cry. Ugly, broken crying, the kind that doesn't care about dignity. She told me she'd done it to protect me. She told me I didn't understand what he was. She told me she was afraid. I held her. I told her I loved her. I told her I was going anyway. Because here is the thing about being raised on a lie. When it cracks, it doesn't crack cleanly. It doesn't shatter and leave you with nothing. It cracks open, and through the crack you can see something you never knew was there. And you can't unsee it. You can't unfeel the cold air coming through. I needed to see Caden Blackthorn with my own eyes. I needed to look at the monster and understand what I was made of. The drive to Ironmore territory took 4 hours. I drove alone. My mother had refused to come. Renner offered to send an escort. I refused. This was not a pack matter. This was mine. The Ironmore territory was massive. I understood that as soon as I crossed the boundary line, the invisible wall of scent markers that said this land belongs to us and we are many and we are old. The trees changed, denser, older. Douglas firs so tall their tops were lost in cloud. The road narrowed to a single lane that wound up through mountain switchbacks, and every mile deeper I went, I felt the weight of the pack's presence like a hand on my chest. Strong, that was the word. This pack was profoundly, historically strong. I had spent 15 years preparing to hate the source of that strength. I pulled up to the main lodge as the sun was starting to go amber. It was not what I expected. I think I'd imagined something like a fortress, all high walls and locked gates, the architectural expression of tyranny. Instead, it was a long, low building of dark timber and river stone, lit warm from inside, with a covered porch where two older wolves sat on chairs and watched me park my truck with expressions of calm assessment. Working dogs at rest. Not aggressive. Just watching. One of them went inside. I sat in my truck for 30 seconds, breathed, checked the anger I'd carried for 15 years like a weapon, making sure it was still there, making sure I had something between me and whatever came next. Then I got out. He was already on the porch by the time I came up the steps. I don't know what I expected. A villain is, by nature, a disappointment in person. Villains are supposed to be obvious, something in the eyes, some wrongness to the face that explains how they're capable of the things they've done. You look at them and think, yes, I can see it. Yes, that makes sense. Caden Blackthorn did not make sense. He was tall. I mean, genuinely tall. The kind that isn't about imposing but just is, built on a different scale than most people, broad across the shoulders, carrying the physical ease of a wolf who has never once in his life been unsure of his body. Dark hair threaded through with early gray at the temples. A face that had been arranged by time and weight into something serious. The kind of face that doesn't offer you much at first and makes you feel like you have to earn what's underneath. He looked at me, and I understood, in that moment, what the young Ironmore messenger had felt in Ashvale. The recognition. The completion of a puzzle. Because Caden Blackthorn and I had the same eyes. Not similar, the same. The exact same dark gray. The exact same particular angle at the outer corners. The exact same way of looking at something, direct, taking inventory, revealing nothing. I had spent 22 years looking at those eyes in mirrors. He exhaled once, sharp and hard, like he'd been punched. Then he was still. Lena, he said, not a question, a statement. And something more, something under the name, some weight I wasn't ready to put a word to. Alpha Blackthorn, I said. My voice was steady. I was furious at myself for how steady it was, because steady meant civil, and I wasn't sure I was ready to be civil. You came alone, I did. He looked past me at my truck, then back at my face. Something moved through his expression, not surprise, something older than surprise. Something that had had 15 years to be sad. Come inside, he said, please. Part 3. The truth is he knew it. We sat in his office, bookshelves floor to ceiling, a fire going even though it wasn't cold enough for one. I wondered if it was habit or if he'd lit it deliberately. Something to do with his hands. Something to fill the silence. He didn't speak for a long moment. He sat across from me with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and he looked at me the way you look at something you thought you'd never see. I'll tell you everything, he said, all of it, and then I want you to ask me whatever you need to ask me. And I'll answer that too. I'm not going to manage what you think of me at the end of this. That's yours, I nodded once. He told me. He told me that 23 years ago, he and my mother had been young. He'd been a new alpha, barely 25, just taken leadership of Ironmore from his father, still learning the weight of it. She had been the daughter of his beta, sharp and beautiful and restless, always pushing at the edges of things. They had been, for about 8 months, everything to each other. I loved her, he said simply, without performance. I want you to understand that. I know she painted a different picture, but I loved her. Then Jonas Vasquez came into it. A young wolf from a border pack, charming and aimless, who had attached himself to Ironmore with vague intentions of joining. My mother had turned to him during a stretch when Caden was consumed by a territorial crisis. Not a deep relationship, Caden said. A few months. But enough. She became pregnant. She didn't know at first whose. She told me about Jonas, Caden said. Told me what had happened while I was distracted. He paused. Chose his words carefully. I was not graceful about it. I was 25 and I was an alpha and I was in love with her and I was not graceful. He sent Jonas away. Not a challenge, a dismissal. Pack authority. Jonas left. My mother, furious, left with him. I didn't know she was pregnant, he said. She never told me. I found out 6 years later, through a wolf who'd passed through Ashvale and seen you. His jaw tightened. By the time I tried to contact her, she'd built a whole story. And she didn't want me to have any part of it. I sat with this for a while. She told me you killed Jonas Vasquez. Something crossed his face. Not guilt, grief. Jonas Vasquez died in a territory fight between his birth pack and a neighboring clan 3 years after he left here. I had nothing to do with it. She took his name. She gave it to you. He looked at the fire. I don't know if she believed the story eventually, or if she always knew and told it anyway. That's between her and her conscience. The anger I'd brought with me was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer aimed cleanly. It was a cloud now, diffuse and complicated, filling the whole room. So what do you want from me? I asked. You sent for me. You want what? You want me to call you Dad? Join your pack. What is this? He looked at me then. Fully, with those gray eyes that were my gray eyes. I want to know you, he said. I'm not asking you to rewrite your life. I'm not asking you to be angry at your mother, though you might be, and that's yours to work through. I'm not asking you to move here or swear loyalty or anything that takes more than you want to give. He paused. I'm asking you to sit across from me for a few days and let me see who you are. Because I've been wondering for 15 years. I didn't say anything. You don't have to forgive me for not fighting harder to find you, he said. You don't have to forgive her for raising you on a lie. You don't have to do anything. But you drove for hours. You came alone. So I think some part of you wants to know too. He wasn't wrong. I hated that he wasn't wrong. Part 4, what blood means. I stayed 5 days. I told myself it was reconnaissance. Gathering information. Seeing the monster in his habitat before I made any decisions about what it all meant. I told myself a lot of things in those first days that I later understood were just the mind's way of letting the heart move without admitting it's moving. Ironmore was not what I'd been taught to expect. The pack was large, over 200 wolves, which made it one of the biggest in the Northwest, but it had none of the cold hierarchy I'd imagined. It was a pack where the youngest cubs ran up to their alpha without fear, and he knew every one of their names. Where the oldest wolves were treated with the particular respect that comes not from obligation but from genuine culture. Where disputes were settled in the open, argued loudly, decided fairly. I watched Caden work. I watched him mediate a land dispute between two families that had been simmering for a decade. I watched him sit with a wolf who'd lost his mate in a hunting accident, sitting with him, not performing comfort but just existing in the same space, which is sometimes all grief needs. I watched him in the morning runs, not leading from the front to prove something but running in the middle of the pack, embedded in it, part of it. He was not a monster, he was something harder to hate, a person, a complicated, fallible, real person who had made mistakes when he was young and had spent 15 years living with the consequences. F them. On the third day, I shifted and ran with the Ironmore wolves. I'd been nervous about it, entering someone else's pack run as an outsider, especially as an outsider with contested blood ties. Felt like walking into a room full of conversations that stopped when you entered. But it wasn't like that. The Ironmore wolves were curious, not hostile. They circled me at the start with their noses working, taking inventory, and I felt the moment some of them recognized it. The echo of their alpha in my scent, and made their peace with me quickly and in the particular. Wordless way of wolves. Caden ran beside me for a long stretch of it. We didn't communicate the way wolves in the same pack communicate. The subtle body language shortcuts of years together. But we found a rhythm anyway. Side by side through old-growth forest, moving at the same pace. Occupying the same space without conflict, it was the easiest I'd felt in years. I thought about that on the drive home. Wondered what it meant that my bones had always carried this place and I'd never known it. My mother was waiting when I got back. She looked like she hadn't slept in 5 days, which she probably hadn't. She looked like she'd been rehearsing a speech and forgotten it. She looked like my mother, fierce and frightened and entirely sure of her love for me, even now. "Tell me what he said," she said. I told her, all of it. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and she didn't cry this time. She was somewhere past crying. She was in that flatland that comes after the worst is already done. "I'm sorry," she said when I finished. "I'm sorry I lied to you. I'm sorry I kept you from him. I'm sorry she stopped, breathed. I was so angry at him. And I was so ashamed of myself. And I was so afraid that if he knew about you, he'd take you, and I couldn't." Her voice broke on the last word and she held it together by main force. "I couldn't lose you. You were all I had left." "I know," I said, and I did. Understanding and forgiveness are different countries, and I wasn't sure I'd arrived at the second yet, but I could see it from where I was standing. "He's not a bad man," she admitted. It cost her. I could see what it cost her to say it. He was a bad young man. And I was a bad young woman. And we were terrible together, and we made you. A sound came out of her that wasn't quite a laugh. "We made you, and that's," she shook her head. "That's something." I reached across and took her hand. She gripped it like a lifeline. Epilogue. What I know now. Here is what I know at 22, that I didn't know at 7, or 14, or 21. Monsters are the stories we tell to make sense of pain. They're not always lies. Sometimes people do monstrous things, and the story that calls them a monster is the only story that keeps us standing. My mother needed a monster so she could keep moving. I needed a monster so I could keep burning. We're both allowed that. We're both allowed to have needed it. But you can only live inside a story for so long before it starts to eat you. I go to Ironware twice a month now. I have my own room in the lodge. Caden set it up without my asking. Just mentioned it quietly and left the door to decide itself. We're figuring out a language for each other. It's slower than either of us would like and faster than either of us expected. He doesn't push. He doesn't perform. He just shows up, consistent and present, in the particular way that people who know they have a debt to pay show up, quietly, without demanding credit for it, just working. I'm not calling him Dad yet. But the word sits in my mouth sometimes, at the end of sentences, and I'm not moving it away as fast as I used to. My mother is learning to forgive herself, which is harder for her than forgiving him or forgiving me. She asked to speak to Caden on the phone last month. I don't know what they said. Some things belong to the people who lived them. I think about Jonas Vasquez sometimes, the man who was my father in name, who I never met, who died without knowing a child had been given his name. I think about what it means to be built out of so many absences. A mother's fear. A father's grief. A dead man's borrowed name. And then I stop thinking about it, because I am also built out of presences. The pack at Ashvale, who raised me rough and real and unafraid. My mother's stubborn, flawed, enormous love. 5 days at Ironmore and the feeling of running beside a man who gave me my eyes. The dark firs and the cold mountain air and the knowledge, still new, still tender, like a healed wound, that I belonged to more places than I was told. Everything I'd been told was a lie, but everything I'd become in the shadow of that lie was mine, fully, unquestionably mine, and that, I think, is where the real story starts.